gentlemen. So I was going to do, like Jingle Bells thing here, where you do this routine. But I got one better. Last year, my wife gave me the real redneck Christmas shotgun shell lights. Now, the scary side of this actually is that these are made in China. And so although it has 12 on the back for 12 gauge, it's got something written in Chinese on it too. So these are probably commissioned from the Chinese military. Nothing classes up a show like flamingos and ducks. And so I brought, my flamingo lights, and, if you ever get them untangled, they kind of light up nice. Where's the plug? Flamingos and ducks. And jingle bells, shotgun shells, whatever comes next, and it's not working, but oh well, because I unplugged it. There, much better, isn't that classy? And the actual ceremonial things. Chelsea, are you out there? Here's your twin sister's ornament. This is a flamingo from Seattle. Those are important. The mug says bah humbug, by the way. Ordinarily, I would give like a full-voiced bah humbug, but there was a student about 3 years ago that objected to that. She thought I didn't like Christmas, which was sort of true. And let's see, I got some more duck ornaments. This one is from an Indian reservation in Montana. And again, the perfunctory flamingo and more ducks and stuff. But it wouldn't be complete without a Triceratops Christmas ornament. So there it is, right there, folks. Oh, he doesn't stand up very well. Yeah, well, he's been dead for centuries, right? It's pretty gross slippers, probably because I wear them to mow the lawn, but and like the most important thing, you can't have a Santa Claus without a pipe. I'm not sure what got smoked in there. I haven't used it. I'm pretty sure I remember that from the college dorms. Maybe not the Chicago college. Okay, as is, also welcome alumni. My friend from nice to see you. It's a tradition. My children come up here and sit. Hey, my goodness.
Come on.
Hey, really? Good grief. People that go back like 5 or 6 years. All right. The thing that we read is, I guess it's on the overhead there, lasts. This is like the last Moody Spokane Christmas Chapel. So there's one place, there's a couple of choke points in here for me. There may be like a couple dozen choke points for me today, because this is it. And there is actually a point to this. I know all of maybe that's why the shepherds were watching sheep instead of goats, was because of the song. But there is actually a Christmas point to this story. Let's get back here. Okay, so you want to take yourself back a century. It was early winter. A morning mist lingered over the frosty fields in Locke Center. The snow whirled along the rail bed in front of the 628 freight line, hurtling along the tracks out of Lansing bound for Detroit. Frankie was the youngest boy in the Stoll clan. He was all of 10. He shared his room with his two older brothers, Will, who was 13, and Ernest, the 16-year-old. They all awoke to the whistle of the 628 as it chuffed to a stop at the water tower on the edge of their property. Frankie sprang out of bed and leapt to the window light. "She's steaming in, and right on time, too," he sang out excitedly. The boys dressed as fast as they could and tumbled down the stairs to their ma's kitchen. There were chores to do before school, and they had to help get the breakfast for their guests that would soon arrive at the back door. The kitchen was already smelling like the hotcakes and warm molasses. The aroma of coffee and chicory was hanging low in the air. The coffee would be good about this point. Thick rashers of bacon and salt pork were spitting and sizzling in the pan on the wood stove. Frankie's 3 younger sisters were already downstairs. Bertha turned out a skillet of cornbread to cool on the sideboard. She was 9, the oldest girl still at home. Alta, the 6-year-old, was getting eggs from the glassine crock to be fried up, while Iva, the 3-year-old, played with corn dolls in the pantry. Frankie's 3 older sisters, Stella, Ada, and Mabel, had all gone to normal school and were teaching, though Stella, the oldest, had gotten married and was the mother of a 3-year-old girl. She and her husband were farming the spread right next, over the holler. "Look, it's Mr. Dunkley. He's the engineer today," Will announced as he looked out the kitchen window light. Their ma looked and smiled, then surveyed the raggedy men, hobos, who were coming up to the house behind them. Mrs. Stoll swung open the back door and handed the engineer a stoking cup of hot coffee. "Step in. Looks like that cold out there is blowing up your back," she called out. Then she served up a plate of the hot cakes for him. "You boys see to it that those men out there get washed up in full hot grub too," she said as she drizzled molasses on the hot cakes and motioned for the 4 men huddled together. Ernest, Will, and Frankie toted baskets of food to the back door. Bertha set out a bucket of steaming water with a chunk of lye soap and a towel. The men dragged off their mufflers and hats, rolled up their threadbare sleeves, and washed themselves. "Much obliged," they muttered. Mr. Dunkel, like most of the engineers and the bulls on this line, weren't supposed to allow hobos on his train, but he knew times were hard and that those men got very little kindness from this old world, so he turned a blind eye. Frankie kept the hobos' cups filled with hot coffee. Most of them had come through before, except one. Frankie noticed that the man couldn't stop shivering. Wearing a fur hat but a threadbare coat, he seemed much older than the others. I'm kind of owning this hobo thing here. Catch me 7 paychecks from now. Mrs. Stowell chatted with the men. She always called the travelers Mr. You guys all know my vision of this. I'm going to be standing out here on the corner with a cardboard sign that says "Will parse verbs for food." All right, meanwhile, back at the story. That's how we keep from crying, right? Frankie kept the hobos' cups filled with hot coffee. Most of them had come through before, except one. Frankie noticed that the man couldn't stop shivering. Wearing a fur hat but threadbare coat, he seemed much older than the others. He smiled warmly when Frankie filled his cup. Mrs. Stoll chatted with the men. She always called the travelers Mr., even though they had names like Boxcar Eddie or Too Tall Jake or Bull Trip Charlie. "What's your name, mister?" Frankie finally asked the old man. The man's eyes softened up. "Jump Up Billy," he said. When he reached up for Frankie to fill his cup again, Frankie could see under his coat he didn't have a shirt. Frankie raced up to his room and pawed through the sweaters drawer. Most of the sweaters were too little for Frankie, let alone a big old man like Jump Up Billy. And Frankie pulled out his best sweater, the only one that would be big enough. He especially loved that sweater because Stella had knitted it for him last Christmas, but that old man needed it far more than he did. Frankie stuffed it under his waistcoat. He didn't want his ma to see what he was doing with it. Outside, he pulled the old man away from the others, and behind the shed gave the sweater to him. The old man threw off his coat and eagerly pulled the sweater on, smiling as he stroked it. "Now ain't this purty," he whispered. "There's fire in her bellies, boys. Time to set off. Set to the rails," Mr. Dunkel called out after bolting down the last gulp of his coffee. Frankie hurriedly helped the old man on with his coat. "Best victuals this side of the Rockies, missus." Mr. Dunkel called out as he and the hobos crossed the field to the waiting train. When all the hobos had crawled into their open boxcars, they lifted their hats and waved as the 628 Blutz whistle and jolted to a start. The big iron wheels pumped and spun in place as billows of steam hissed and puffed with each turn. Finally, the train jerked, all the cars made a clanging sound, and the train was underway. As Mrs. Stoll and the others went into the house, Frankie watched the train until it disappeared, its whistle growing fainter and fainter. It made Frankie think about his pa. Christmas is almost here. Pa should have been back by now. Frankie was looking forward to gathering the boughs of green for the mantle, but the oranges were always the crowning touch. 9 of them, one for each of the Stoll children. Their father had driven horse and buggy all the way to Lansing to fetch those precious oranges back home in time for Christmas. Mr. Dunkel had said that there was powerful bad weather, and this year Mrs. Longtree had picked him to be the archangel. "Hold still, Frankie," Mrs. Stoll scolded. "I can barely see these here small pins, and your wiggling doesn't help." "When are you going to go get spectacles, Ma?" Frankie was only half teasing. "When pigs can fly, son. We sure can't afford spectacles. We haven't finished paying off our winter hog," she answered. "If times are that hard for us, Ma, then we sure can't afford to feed all them hobos every week," Will said. Mrs. Stoll gave Will a withering look. "We had an abundant harvest. Don't cost us nothing to share some of it with folks that could use it." Just then, there was a stomping on the front porch. The door flew open and snow whirled into the parlor. "It's Ada and Mabel. Look, Ma, they're home. They're to home," Bertha and Alta sang out as they leapt into their older sister's arms. Everyone cheered and hugged. "But where's Pa?" Ada called out. "He's always here to greet us," Mabel added. Their Ma told them about the bad weather and that their father was probably delayed because of it. Later that evening, Stella, Fred, and baby May arrived. Soon everyone was in the kitchen helping Ma with supper. Frankie smiled to himself. It was almost as if none of them had left home. Everyone was together again. As they sat down to eat, Mrs. Stoll said a right perfect blessing. Frankie was so hungry and everything looked so good. "Frankie," Stella began, "this year I knitted you a muffler to match the Christmas sweater I gave you last year. I can't wait to see how it will look." Frankie almost choked on his mashed potatoes. "Maybe you should try it on tonight," Mrs. Stoll sang out. Frankie squirmed and changed the subject. "Do you think Pa will still try to bring home all the Christmas oranges, him being so late and all?" "Nothing in this world would stop him from bringing home our Christmas oranges, boy," Mrs. Stoll whispered. Conversation around the table successfully switched to talk of Pa and the oranges. Frankie sighed with relief. Another whole day passed and the Stoll household was uneasy. Pa still wasn't home and they hadn't gotten any word. Christmas was only 2 days away. Pa had never been this late in from Lansing to fetch the oranges from the Florida train. Ada and Mabel had busied themselves with baking and decorating cookies. Bertha and Alta were helping roll out the fondant. And Ernest, Frankie, and Will, hey, there's words in this book I don't understand. I just read it, okay? Ernest and Frankie and Will were eyeing the cakes baked for the social that was always held after the pageant on Christmas Eve. Even so, all their hearts were heavy with worry. Pa would have picked the perfect tree for the parlor by now, Frankie said sadly. And there'd be greens on the hearth with apples and cookies too, Bertha whispered. "No oranges," little Iva gurgled, pointing at the mantel. That's a really hard one. Oranges. Little Iva gurgled, pointing at the mantel. Even she knew that Christmas Eve meant the oranges were placed on the mantel. Just then, Mrs. Stoll bustled into the parlor. She was worried, all right, but she didn't show it. "Now, hark, children. Everybody get on your winter togs. I got soapstone already heating in the stove. Will, you and Ernest, hitch up the sledge dray. We're going out to find the perfect tree and gather up them greens for the mantel," she announced. "That's what your pa would want us all to do, not sit here in the parlor all vexed with botherment." Everyone's spirits lifted, scurrying for their coats. They set out to do as their mother had bid them. The soapstones were wrapped in burlap, placed on the floor of the sled dray. 4 thick wool blankets covered them all, and they set out to find their Christmas tree and evergreens. Penny and Fanny's steps were sure and steady, and the bells on their harnesses rang and echoed across the snowy dells. Bertha, Alta, and Frankie were singing as they went. Finally, they came to a clearing. It was dotted with fine firs and pines. The family poured out of the sled dray and fanned out. "The girls and I will get the greens. You boys go get our perfect tree," Mrs. Stoll called out. Frankie, Will, and Ernest searched everywhere for the perfect tree. How they wished their pa was with them. Just when they were wondering if they would ever find that tree, they came over a small hillock, and there it was. All by itself, as if it were just waiting there to become the tree in the Stoll parlor. I see my students are getting younger. Children and grandchildren all over the place here today. There doesn't, let's see, did I just skip a page? Okay, got it. There, doesn't that look grand? Mrs. Stoll cooed that night as she adjusted the last clump of greens on the mantel. "I'll go get the apples and nuts." Am I jumped ahead? Is this the page that I stuck my chewing gum in last year? Nope, I'm where I'm supposed to be. I'm on this picture here. There we go. Had to prime the pump a little bit there. All right, I'll go get the apples and nuts, Alta called out. "I want to put the dried flowers and the holly sprigs on," Bertha squealed. Meantime, Frankie, Will, and Ernest were sinking the tree into a bucket of wet sand while Ada and Mabel gave them orders just as they did every Christmas. No, it isn't straight from here," Ada scolded. "A little more to your right. Then the fullest part of the tree will be facing the wall," Mabel said. The boys twisted and turned, trying to lean the tree this way and that. Suddenly, all the others shouted in unison, "That's it! It's perfect!" They all stood back. It was perfect. Then the whole family started decorating the tree. "What a glorious surprise this will be for your pa when he gets home," Mrs. Stoll whispered. Not for 1 minute did anyone think that he wouldn't get home. Ma and Ada strung berries and popcorn to put on the tree while Bertha and Alta tied on dried flowers. Frankie and Iva hung the frosted cookies, though they probably ate more than they hung. The fire was crackling in the fireplace. Everything seemed so warm and cozy. And Frankie looked out the parlor window. It was snowing real hard again. "How will Pa get through this?" he said with alarm. Everyone came to the window. "The mantel looks so bare without the oranges," Frankie blurted out. "The oranges," Alta scolded. "Is that all you can think about?" Mabel added. "Frankie, it isn't like you to be so selfish. Who cares if oranges ever get here? All we want is Pa," Bertha cried. That wasn't what Frankie had meant at all, but with everyone being so upset, tempers were frayed. "I ain't selfish, Ma," Frankie cried later that night. "Alls I meant was that the oranges being there would mean Pa's home safe and sound." "I know that, and so do they. We're all so worried about your Pa, but maybe he'll be home by tomorrow. We'll pray for that tonight," his mother said as she kissed her youngest son goodnight. That night, Frankie prayed for a miracle to bring his Pa home, but outside it snowed and snowed and snowed, and by morning all the roads were closed. There was no way for his buggy to get home. The next morning, the morning of Christmas Eve, Frankie and his brothers awoke to the 6:28 whistle as it steamed through the pasture. When Frankie came down to breakfast, he was wearing his old gray sweater. He had almost outgrown it. "Frankie, aren't you going to wear your sister Stella's Christmas sweater?" his ma asked. "She and Fred will be coming over after the pageant this evening." Frankie was about to tell his ma the truth when Will called out, "It's Pa! It's Pa!" Everyone ran to the parlor. They almost swept their Pa clean off his feet with their hugs and their kisses. "My little lambs, my precious little lambs." Note, not goats. Their Pa whispered as he hugged each of them. "Oh, Frank," Mrs. Stoll cried, "however did you get here?" "Well, when I met that train from Florida at the station to fetch home these here oranges, I could hardly see the engine, it was snowing so bad. Then I found out all the roads was closed, my heart fair broke." "But you're here, Pa," Will exclaimed. "And I wouldn't be if it hadn't been for Mr. Dunkel. He overheard me lamenting about not getting home, and he said that there was only one thing for me to do, ride the 628. Why, he even let me sit up there in the engine with him all the way here. And he loaded the horse and buggy into a boxcar and brought them right along with us. Now I just wonder what would make him think so kind on me and my family. Pa looked over at Ma when he said that. I tell you, Rose, it was a miracle. That's what it was. Over to the church, Pa said as he pulled the cover off the crate with the luscious oranges inside. Each of the children, young and old, took an orange out of the box and placed it on the mantelpiece. When everyone stood and looked at them, how beautiful they were. 9 oranges nestled in the greens, one for each one of them. Hark now, children. Don't be tempted to touch them. They're for our Christmas Eve supper tonight, Pa said as he went with the rest of the family to dress for church. Frankie loved this day most of all, and since he was already dressed, he stayed in the parlor. He walked over to the mantel and gazed at the splendid oranges. His heart sang that his Pa was home and safe. He looked at the oranges closer and closer. He could smell the pungent aroma of their skins. He noticed how they seemed to have pores, just like his own skin. Finally, he couldn't resist. He looked to see if anyone was in the kitchen. Even though he'd been told not to, he gently touched his orange. Then he picked it up. It smelled like sunshine. It was ripe and heavy with juice. He couldn't wait to taste it that night. Suddenly he heard someone coming. His mother, "Frankie," she called. And he didn't have time to put the orange back on the mantel. He quickly stuffed it into his sweater. He put it back when they got home from the pageant, and no one would know that he had disobeyed his father. Frankie was indeed a perfect archangel in the Christmas pageant. Everyone commented on how he looked just like a real angel. Later, as they were making their way home in the sleigh, bumping over the hills and dells, Frankie was exploding with the thought of eating his orange that night. Then he remembered. He felt in his sweater. To his horror, the orange wasn't there. He must have dropped it. Frankie looked up at his pa's face and fought back the tears. How could he have been so careless? His orange, his precious orange, lost. Finally, home, Frankie hurried to his room. He wept bitterly, afraid to go down to the parlor and face his family. There was a knock on the door. His mom, "Frankie, dear, everyone's waiting. We're ready to tell stories. The popcorn is popping. And then it will be time for the oranges." Frankie opened the door. "Oh, Ma, I've done a terrible thing." "What do you mean?" his mother said as she patted him. As she patted him to sit next to her on his bed. "I lost my orange," Frankie blurted out. "What? But how, Frankie?" "When everyone was getting dressed, I just wanted to hold that orange, and so I did. And I was just looking at it, nothing more than that. But Pa said not to touch him. So when you came in, I slipped it into my sweater. I was going to put it back, Ma," he stopped, "but I lost it." "Oh, my dear boy, your Pa went through so much to fetch those oranges home for us," his mother whispered. "That's not all, Ma. Stella's sweater. I gave it to one of those hobos," he sobbed. When his mother finally spoke, she said, "Frankie, you didn't do a terrible thing. Maybe a thoughtless thing, taking the orange, but you did a noble thing too, giving something that meant so much to you to someone who needed it. That's the true spirit of Christmas, my darling. Now you stay here and collect yourself. I'll call you when we're ready tonight," Ma whispered almost mysteriously. When Frankie finally did come downstairs, all of his brothers and sisters were waiting. "We have something for you, Frankie," Stella said as she handed him a bright orange with a pink ribbon tied around it. When Frankie looked at the orange, he noticed that it was made up of wedges, 8 wedges. The ribbon held them together. He looked at all of his brothers and sisters. Each of them held out his or her orange. A section of each was missing. They had all given him a wedge of their own orange to make an orange for Frankie. "Our family is like your orange, Frankie," their Pa said softly. "Love holds us together like that there ribbon." That was the most splendid Christmas ever for Frankie and for all the Stolls. The oranges were eaten, all 9 of them savored down to the last bite. Stories were told in front of the fireplace. Popcorn was popped and eaten, and hot chocolate was slurped down with gusto. And when the family was snug in their beds that night, Frankie's mom and pa looked at him. They would tell for years to come how beautiful he was, that he looked like a sleeping angel, how precious that particular Christmas was to all of them. It was always known ever after as Frankie's Christmas. Now, let me give you the epilogue on this story. A lot of you have been here before and heard it, but generations have passed since that day. Our dear Frankie never made it past childhood. That Christmas was his last. But the descendants of Stella and her sisters and brothers set out greens with oranges in their stoves or mantles. We all do this every Christmastide. When the season ends, we always feel a little sad as we remove the mantle greens and oranges. The boughs are tinder dry, the oranges are leathery and brown, all except one, a Christmas miracle, we suspect. In all of our households, there always seems to be one single orange that is fresh as the day it was placed there. We call it, in my family, Frankie's orange. And that's the point of all this. All y'all have family and friends that you're going to be seeing over the next month. I know you have purgatory is next week. That's fine. I know you've got that part to deal with. But after that, you're going to be seeing family and friends, and some of those will be the last time you see them. Ladies, you're really good at this, living in the moment. Guys, you really need to live in the moment for the next couple months. Cherish those relationships you have, because you don't know how long they're going to last. Peace out.